Think about the last time a relationship ended, not how it ended, but the moment you realized, weeks or months later, that you had been here before. Not the same person, not the same circumstances, but the same shape, the same pull towards someone who could not quite be there for you, the same familiar distance, the same quality of reaching and not quite arriving. Most people attribute this to bad luck, to bad taste, to some character flaw that keeps them choosing poorly. John Bowlby had a different explanation, and it goes back much further than any adult choice you have ever made. Bowlby was born in London in 1907, the fourth of 6 children in an upper-middle-class family. He was raised, as was the custom of his class and time, primarily by a nanny. His mother warm, present enough on occasion, but by the standards of what we now know about early development, substantially unavailable, he saw for approximately 1 hour each day. When he was 4, his nanny left the family. He described the experience as devastating. He went on to study medicine at Cambridge, then trained as a psychoanalyst, working alongside Donald Winnicott at the Tavistock Clinic in London, whose work on the true self and false self we explored in the previous video. The two men worked in the same institution, knew each other well, and were asking the same question from different angles. What does early relationship do to a person? Winnicott from the inside. How does the self form? Bowlby from the outside. What happens when the connection is broken, insufficient, or absent? In the late 1940s, the World Health Organization commissioned Bowlby to study the mental health of homeless and institutionalized children in post-war Europe. What he found was not what anyone expected. The children in the best-equipped institutions, clean, warm, fed, medically attended, were nonetheless developing profound emotional and cognitive problems. Something essential was missing. Not food, not shelter, not safety in the physical sense. They were missing consistent, responsive relationship. They were missing what Bowlby would spend the rest of his life trying to describe with precision. There is something in Bowlby's biography that I think is worth sitting with for a moment before we continue. He built an entire theory about the damage caused by insufficient early relationship, and the first relationship he ever had was insufficient in exactly the way his theory would later describe. Whether that gave him unusual clarity or unusual blindness, I am not sure. Both, probably. If any of this is already landing, if you recognize the shape of what he is describing, I want to invite you to stay with this channel. Not as a subscription to content, but as a commitment to this kind of examination. And if you have a thought about whether you think you recognize your own early template, I read everything in the comments. The question is worth sitting with. Bowlby's central argument begins with an evolutionary claim that human infants are biologically wired to form attachment, not as a nice extra, as a survival mechanism. The infant who stays close to a protective adult is more likely to survive. The behaviors that keep the infant close, crying, clinging, following, protesting separation, are not accidents of temperament. They are the operating instructions of a system that evolved over millions of years. But Bowlby was not primarily interested in the biology. He was interested in what happens when the attachment system is activated, when the infant is frightened, overwhelmed, uncertain, and the attachment figure is not reliably available, not absent, just not reliably there, not predictably responsive, not consistently attuned. Because this is where individual differences begin to form. Not in some fixed constitutional trait, not in genetics. In the repeated, daily, accumulating experience of, when I signal distress, what happens? When I reach, am I met? When I am frightened, does someone come? The answers to these questions worked out through hundreds of small interactions across the first months and years of life form what Bowlby called the internal working model. The internal working model is Bowlby's most important and least understood concept. It is not an attitude or a habit. It is something more fundamental, a template for how relationship works. A set of unconscious expectations about what other people will do, what I can expect from them, and what I am worth in their eyes. Think of it as the relationship operating system that your brain compiled before you had language to think about relationships. Every interaction with your primary caregiver was a data point. Cry and be met. People are reliable. Cry and be ignored. People are not. Reach and be held. I am worth holding. Reach and be pushed away. I am not. None of this is cognitive. None of it is conscious. It is encoded in the body, in the nervous system's learned predictions about what will happen next in a relational context. By the age of 3, Bowlby argued, the internal working model is largely in place, not permanently fixed, but operating, guiding, filtering. And this is the part that most people find difficult to accept. Every new relationship is processed through this template. Every new person who expresses interest, every potential intimacy, every moment of vulnerability, the internal working model is running in the background, interpreting what is happening, generating predictions, shaping responses. The person who learned that people are not reliably available does not simply hold this as an abstract belief. They perceive the world through it. They notice the signs of unavailability that others miss. They miss the signs of availability that others notice. They create, without knowing it, the conditions that confirm what they already know. This is not irrationality. It is, in the deepest sense, the opposite. The internal working model is exquisitely rational. It is the most accurate prediction engine the developing brain can build from the data it has. The tragedy is not that it was wrong. It was right for the conditions in which it formed. The tragedy is that it continues to apply those early conditions to every subsequent situation, whether or not they are still accurate. Bowlby's colleague Mary Ainsworth made his theory testable in a way it had never been before. Working in Baltimore in the 1970s, she devised an experiment that has since become the most replicated study in developmental psychology, the strange situation. The procedure is simple. A mother and a 12-month-old infant enter an unfamiliar room. A stranger enters. The mother leaves briefly. The mother returns. Ainsworth and her team watched what the infant did, particularly at the moment of reunion. Not at the separation. At the reunion. What they found is that infants respond in fundamentally different ways. And those ways map almost perfectly onto the quality of caregiving they had received at home. Infants whose mothers were consistently responsive were distressed by separation and quickly comforted on reunion. They could be upset, they could be calmed. They had what Ainsworth called a secure base, a relationship reliable enough to return to after distress. Infants whose mothers were inconsistently responsive, sometimes there, sometimes not, unpredictably available, were intensely distressed by separation and difficult to comfort on reunion. They clung, protested, pushed away. They had learned that the attachment figure might or might not be there, which meant proximity was never quite enough to produce security. Anxious attachment, the strategy of a nervous system that has learned to turn up the volume on distress signals because quieter signals were not reliably answered. Infants whose mothers had been consistently rejecting of distress, responding to need with withdrawal, with apparent discomfort at closeness, showed almost no distress at separation. They appeared fine. Self-sufficient, they turned away from the mother on reunion, busied themselves with toys, showed no obvious need for comfort. This is not independence. This is the strategy of a nervous system that has learned to suppress its own attachment needs because expressing them reliably produced rejection rather than comfort. Avoidant attachment, the appearance of not needing, protecting itself from the pain of reaching and being turned away. A fourth pattern was identified later, disorganized attachment. found most often in children who had experienced frightening or chaotic caregiving, where the attachment figure was simultaneously the source of fear and the person to whom fear is supposed to be brought. These infants had no coherent strategy: freeze, collapse, approach, and retreat. The system that was supposed to produce safety had been wired to terror. Now comes the part that most people find both obvious and impossible to fully accept. These patterns do not stay in childhood. The internal working model formed in the first years of life becomes, in the absence of significant new experience, the template for all subsequent relationships. The anxiously attached child becomes the adult who monitors their partner's availability with a vigilance that exhausts both people. The avoidantly attached child becomes the adult who genuinely does not understand why their partner complains of distance, because from the inside, they have been giving everything the nervous system learned was safe to give. This is why people repeat, not because they are choosing the same type of person consciously, but because the internal working model is filtering perception in a way that makes familiar relational experiences more legible, more recognizable, more like what relationship is supposed to feel like. The person who grew up with an inconsistently available parent will often find that consistent, reliably available partners feel somehow flat, uninteresting, not quite real, while partners who recreate the familiar rhythm of pursuit and withdrawal feel intensely alive. The feeling of aliveness is the feeling of the familiar, and the familiar is the template built before memory. In a previous video on Karen Horney, we explored how people construct an idealized self, an image of who they must be in order to be acceptable. Bowlby's internal working model runs one level deeper than that. It is not about who you must be. It is about what you can expect from the people around you. And when both are working against each other, when the idealized self demands perfection and the internal working model predicts abandonment, the result is the particular kind of relational suffering that brings people to therapy and keeps them there for years. The internal working model is not destiny. Bowlby was always careful about this. It is a tendency, a default, a starting place. New relationships, particularly relationships that consistently disconfirm the model's predictions, can revise it. Therapy can revise it. Understanding it can revise it, though understanding alone is rarely enough. What changes things is sustained, repeated experience of being met differently, not being told that people are reliable, not believing that people are reliable, experiencing it over and over in the body until the nervous system's prediction updates. There is one more dimension of Bowlby's work that most people encounter only in the context of bereavement, but which I think applies much more broadly. His trilogy on attachment and loss, 3 volumes published over 13 years, includes a volume on grief that changed how the field understood mourning. Before Bowlby, grief was understood primarily as a process of letting go of decathecting, in the Freudian language, withdrawing the emotional investment in the lost person and reinvesting it elsewhere. Bowlby disagreed, not because grief should never end, but because, he observed, grief that proceeds well does not produce detachment. It produces a transformation in the relationship with the lost person. The attachment figure is not abandoned. They are internalized differently, carried differently. What Bowlby found is that the grief process follows predictable phases, not as stages that must be completed in order, but as recurring dimensions of an experience that is being worked through. Protest, the initial refusal to accept the loss, the searching behavior, the anger, despair, the settling into the reality of permanent absence. Reorganization, the gradual restructuring of a life around a different future. The reason this matters beyond bereavement is that the same pattern appears in any significant relational loss the end of a relationship, the loss of a childhood that was not had, the grieving of what a parent was unable to provide. The attachment system does not distinguish cleanly between different kinds of loss. It responds to rupture with the same biological machinery it evolved to use when physical proximity was broken. Many people arrive in adulthood carrying ungrieved losses not from dramatic events necessarily, but from the accumulated small ruptures of an early relationship that was insufficient. The child who learned not to show attachment needs did not only learn to suppress them, they also, in a sense, lost the experience of being genuinely met. And that loss was never mourned, because it was never recognized as a loss. It was just how things were. Bowlby was, in his own way, an optimist. He believed that understanding changes things not immediately, not completely, but genuinely. That the act of seeing the template makes it slightly less automatic, slightly more available for examination. The practice he pointed toward is not dramatic. It is the act of noticing in a moment of relational difficulty what the internal working model is predicting, not what is actually happening. What the model is telling you is about to happen. When a partner is quiet, what does the model predict? When someone does not call back, what does the model predict? When closeness is offered, what does the model predict, and what does it do with that prediction? The question is not whether the prediction is accurate. The question is whether it is new information about this relationship or old information about a relationship that no longer exists. Whether it is seeing what is here or seeing what the template learned to expect. This is very difficult to do in the moment. The internal working model is fast, automatic, and largely outside conscious awareness. It does not announce itself. It simply produces a feeling of anxiety, of distance, of the particular quality of reaching and not arriving that feels like perception but is partly, always, the past. Bowlby worked until the end of his life. He died in 1990 at the age of 83 on the Scottish island where he kept a second home, the place he went to write and to be alone and perhaps to be, in whatever way was available to him, close to something that held. John Bowlby spent his career studying what happens when the first relationship is insufficient. He spent it, in some sense, studying himself, the boy whose mother he saw for 1 hour a day, whose nanny he loved and then lost, who spent a professional lifetime trying to understand what that kind of early separation does to a person. What he gave us is a framework for understanding something that most people experience as inexplicable and personal. Why we keep choosing the same shape of relationship. Why certain kinds of absence feel unbearably familiar. Why closeness that is reliably available can feel oddly flat, while closeness that is intermittent can feel intensely real. It is not a flaw in your character. It is not bad taste. It is the operating system running as designed, in conditions very different from the ones it was designed for. The internal working model is not a verdict. It is a beginning, a place from which the work of understanding, and very gradually revising, can start. If you have found anything in this video that lands something that names a shape you recognize, I hope you carry it forward carefully. Not as an explanation that closes things off, but as a question that opens them. Subscribe to the Lucid Mind. Think deeper. Live clearer.